So, thank you. We're now recording. Thank you. So in terms of introductions, I recognise lots of names here. So if you know me already, thank you very much for joining. And my name's Lucinda, and I'm a chartered psychologist. I run Actus. I also host the HR Uprising podcast, and actually I've got an episode on 360 feedback if you want to know more about that. And all of my contact details are there. In terms of telling you a little bit about the business, but what we do here in Actus, we have performance management software, but actually we have performance management. We do have 360 software as well, actually. So our performance and talent management software, it is about e-appraisal in some people's terms, but we also do learning management, recruitment. I think I've been on too much. We don't do recruitment. That's one thing we don't do. We do learning management. We also do recognition. We do 360 feedback. We do compliance. So it does lots of things to do with embedding better people performance processes in an organization. So I'm just keeping an eye now at what you're doing in there. So it's great. I have to wait for the chat to come through. Let me just share the learning outcomes of this particular session. So what we're going to talk about the pros and cons of 360 feedback. We're going to talk a little bit about maybe common design and process pitfalls. So if you're designing it, what you could be careful to do or not. If you are going to be rolling out 360 feedback, how to set the scene for a positive experience. And I will do a very brief overview of our Actus 360 now for anybody who'd like to know a little bit more about it. So in terms of this, let's have a look. So Vicky, you've done it in the past. They don't do it currently. Sundip, you're running annual 360s this year, so you're using to improve reviews. So that's interesting, Sundip. So are you using it as part of your performance appraisal process? Is that how yours is going to work there? So some people do it like that. Some people, the angle on 360 I'll talk about here is probably about more of a developmental 360 in terms of developing either culture or behaviours. So Jessica, in your organisation, people don't want to do 360. Yes. So this is interesting. So quite a lot of you are seeing it as something's appraisal as opposed to 360. So perhaps I'll differentiate and we can talk about that, because I think it can sit alongside 360 in terms of that. So you're interested in that? Okay, help them specific. Fine, and consider it. Mike, you're thinking about doing it. You'd like to persuade your council to do it either regularly or on leaving. I think that's an interesting one. Maybe, I don't know whether you'd want to do it when people leave. It's more of a survey, maybe an exit survey. I'd suggest you might want to do it to get people to stay. Okay, so use it as part of your performance appraisal process. Right, so let's position it as well in terms of that. So some of you know about 360 feedback and you've maybe experienced it. Of those who've commented there, you have potentially experienced it. So let me know in here if you have experienced 360 feedback. Let's pop a poll up and see what your experience was, or whether you've never experienced it or not. So let us know, what's your view? Have you never experienced it? Have you experienced it and you were not so impressed? Or have you experienced it and you found it really powerful? And an interesting question, which I would put on as a poll next time I do this, would actually be to understand how you've experienced it, because what I'm seeing is quite a lot of you are doing it as part of an appraisal, and I can explain how you can do it in a different way as a development tool. In those of you who are in here, just let me know what your roles are. Are you HR? Are you learning and development, talent, or a manager, or just interested generally? So let us know what sort of roles that you do as well. Your HRs and dip. Right, so I'll end the poll and share. So 83% have had a chance to communicate. So almost half of you haven't come across it, so we can explain a bit more about it. If you have experienced it, you found it really powerful. It is very powerful. And a few of you experienced it and it was underwhelmed. And so if you experienced it and it wasn't a great experience, what was it that was less good about it? Was it the way it was explained or the way it was positioned? Or if you experienced it and it was great, what was it that was good about it? So do share your thoughts in here so we can see it. So great. So we've got mainly HR, L&D, but we've also got Myrna and Mike are managers, so line managers in terms of your experience of it. Okay, and I'll keep an eye on that. So if you've had to keep on telling me what your roles are, so I can see it, the pitch is quite is quite right, I think, for who we've got listening. And let me know if you had a great experience, what was good, and if you had less good experience, what was less good. So I'm going to explain what I would describe as 360-degree feedback for the purpose of this, to help us just make sure we're on the same page with it. So a 360-degree feedback, when I'm referring to it in this context, we are talking about something which is what I would say is quantitative, so graphical, there's a number where you've rated something, and qualitative feedback on an individual's behavior or performance. And it would usually be against specific criteria. And certainly the ones that I would advocate. So if you've got a competency framework, it would be against a set of behaviours that relate to the competencies, or it could be against organisational values. Generally, the feedback would be, so you'd have a set of questions, and then you'd ask those same set of questions to a range of different people. And those people might be typically, the reason it's called 360, it would be someone above you, someone to the side of you, and someone below you. So it might be your line manager, maybe your peers or customers, and direct reports. So all around, that's the idea of the 360 feedback. Now, the benefit of having that 360 feedback is it's much more objective, because it's not just my opinion of that. And the other thing, in this hybrid world that we're in at the moment, often our line managers are not the best judge of how we're performing. So having this 360, and that's where some of you might be saying it might be better in terms of appraisal, having 360 data or feedback from other sources to make sure that that the data is much more objective than just one person's opinion. We would also recommend, in terms of 360 feedback, and not everyone does it this way, but I personally would recommend this, and I've had lots of experience of doing it, is that in an ideal world, you would want to make sure that the responses are anonymized. And we do it in our system by anonymizing it down to 3 people, basically, or no fewer than 3 responses, with the exception of the line manager. So when you're looking at these bars, and I'll show you a report in a moment, where you see the individual or the line manager here, you would see those responses would stand out, and that would just be, they would be identifiable. But anything where it's from, say, my direct reports, it would all be amalgamated. So you'd have at least 3 scores that made up an average, and that way you can't identify one person. Now, I don't know what, I'll ask you the rhetorical question. I realize there's too many of you probably to unmute. Why do you think I advocate anonymity? You can tell me in the chat if you like. I'll give you why I believe it's really important. Why do you think it might be quite good to allow people not to be identified? Now, there is a risk to it as well, but why is anonymity something that I might recommend for the majority of respondents to a 360 feedback? So I dare say that some responses might catch up with me, but the reason that I would recommend anonymity is that it encourages people to be honest and open and to give real feedback. There you go, Julie, we're on the same page. People feel safer to give that genuine feedback. There is, and it does depend on your culture. There are some cultures where we talk about cultures where there's more blame or otherwise, and people wouldn't be honest, or hierarchical cultures where people wouldn't dare say what they really think. And if people are not open and honest, actually the value of that feedback is not there. And you're right, people won't say it because they're worried about being intimidated. So that's, for me, generally, I would say you want 360 feedback to be introduced in a very, very safe way. And that is what I'm going to recommend. The process that I'm going to describe in this webinar is how you can do it in a safe way. If you do it in a safe way, then you find that no one has a nasty experience. And I know some of you have had a less good experience. I've seen that happen. And it makes it a much safer and healthier way. And it's seen as a development conversation. Now, I have worked with organisations who really want feedback to be attributable. I can see the argument, which is sometimes made, that people are much more likely, I suppose, they're not going to write negative things, or if you like. So if their ownership and it's accountable, they're attributable. If you can say who said what, then they're less likely to be negative. But I think you'd rather generally get people to build trust. I would rather educate people to provide constructive quality feedback, not negative feedback, whether it's anonymous or not, than to make it attributable. Then you actually get this trust, and it's much more open and honest. Yes, exactly, Cindy, to prevent feedback bias. So it's a really powerful tool to help people develop self-awareness, but they're only going to develop self-awareness if the feedback is honest, but it's also constructive and sensitively delivered. One of the other things just to point out is that people are more honest when they see feedback, when they consider that feedback is going to be for people's development. There was some research which was published by the CIPD 2 or 3 years ago, which showed that if people thought that the feedback was going to directly relate to somebody's pay or their promotion prospects, they wouldn't always say what they really thought. Whereas if they thought it was going to be used for someone's development, as genuinely for developmental purposes, they would be more honest. So feedback really is about improvement. You're only going to get that if it's quality feedback. However, sometimes you might not think 360 feedback is the right thing to do, or you need to introduce it really carefully. If your organization is not good at providing feedback already, it needs to be sensitively handled. The other reality is that other people's perception is not reality. Just because you've asked multiple people does not mean that they are any more right than the next person. 360 is still ultimately measuring individual perception, but it's still useful. So even though other people might perceive our behavior in a certain way, it's still useful for me to know how my behaviors are perceived, whether or not it's reality. We know that people can be very sensitive to feedback. Sometimes feedback might be situational or out of context. So it might be related to, you just had an argument with somebody and you ask them to give them feedback, they're going to be harder on you than they might have been otherwise. So circumstances can mean that there's a sort of a recency effect where you get the bias from it. I'll bring the rest of these challenges up rather than doing them one at a time here. So the other challenges I'd say with 360 feedback is that what I would say is it's really helpful to make sure you have comments. So sometimes if you just have graphs and you don't have the written comments, you don't get the quality behind it. Whenever I do work with clients to design their 360 feedback, I really make sure that there is an opportunity for people to put free text comments, because you can be left scratching your head because people have interpreted the question in a certain way. However, that said, written feedback, which isn't delivered verbally, may feel harder hitting than if it's something that you're communicating. And I have had experiences where someone, even though I've told them not to, just to look at the overall pattern, people can get quite obsessed about who wrote what, and they try to find out who it was that gave them that feedback. One of my worst examples, and I always guard against this, was a sales director that we used to work with. Actually, I see one of my teams on here who knows who I'm talking about, who was a sales director, and I remember him storming down the sales floor once saying, "Who said this about me?" And the risk of that is so high culturally that people would go, "Oh, I'm never giving feedback again." They were really scared and nervous because he was a really charismatic, strong character. And that can be fearful. So we need to manage any kind of feedback process in a safe way. And then by doing that, we will build a learning culture. You build a psychologically safe culture, which I'm talking about that on our next webinar in March. And it improves self-awareness and overall culture, but only if it's done really, really carefully. The other thing about 360 feedback is, in my opinion, to use it as a development tool, you should actually make sure that the person receives one-to-one coaching or development. And that might, from my view, is why I wouldn't do it as an exit, because at that point, that means you're spending money on someone who's already leaving the business. Why would you want to do that? I would say you want to spend money on people who are in the business and use it to keep them. And it could be a great retention tool. And so in an ideal world, you give people the opportunity to debrief it, and with someone who is a neutral or professional coach, maybe someone in an HR or L&D role, who can make sure that the individual takes that feedback in a constructive way. So the point of it is really, it's a really powerful tool, and it needs to be managed with respect. What are the benefits? Why would I say consider using it? Well, it's a massively powerful development tool. It's one of the most powerful because it's one-to-one. It's about you personally, and it's highly, highly relevant. And if it's coupled with one-to-one coaching and feedback, it's brilliant for career planning and retention. So in that way, you might uncover specific real-life personal development insights about how you are really that other tools might miss, and that people will not tell you to your face. So it's a really, really powerful way of building self-awareness. Now, in this current hybrid environment, people are saying they're not getting access to career opportunities. There are people who are talking about the great exodus of talent and difficulty recruiting. Well, it's a brilliant tool for supporting people in their career development. if you are wanting to put in a career pathway within your organization, what you could do is identify what are the specific skills for, let's say, for a leadership role. And if you've got people who are interested in doing this, and you want to keep them interested to stay in the business, even though there isn't a role there yet, then a 360 feedback could be really useful, because you could get them to have feedback against the skills of the role that they aspire to, and then build a development plan. So they would actually be getting a sense of how close or far away from those requirements they are currently, put those development in place, which means when they do get that role, assuming they do, they're in a better position to get it, but they're going to be better equipped to actually perform in that role as well. The other thing is, in many organizations, people say, oh, the values, they're not worth the paper they're written on. No one really understands what they are. Well, if you identify those values and put real key behaviors behind them, the same with a competency framework, then assess behaviors against it, then that makes it another really powerful tool to bring the values to life. So people can see with a mirror held up against them when they're living the values and when they're not. Other point you were saying, it's about objectivity, because you're getting multiple views. Although it's still not fact, you're still getting different views, not just the line manager, which, as I said earlier, in a hybrid environment, the manager may well hardly see you. And it also provides balance for proximity bias, which is the other way round. So proximity bias is where, if I'm in the office and I see Fred every day, then I'm more likely to give Fred the best job. So I will be close to him, I've got a better relationship with them, so I might be biased in Fred's favour relative to Jane, who works remotely and I only see once every 3 months. So it provides some balance about how people are really performing. So what you can hopefully see there, though, is that I'm talking about something which is a development tool. If you want to put it, and the development tool, what we're really talking about 360 is really useful in terms of behaviours. Where people are talking about 360 as part of an end of year appraisal to make it less tick box, generally what you're looking for is evidence as to whether or not people have achieved their performance, maybe, or maybe you are looking, if you've got a competency framework, but you've got to think about what feedback you're asking people for. And generally 360 has a set of questions, and it's not necessarily going to be, did this person deliver their objectives or not? Because actually, if you've got smart objectives, you shouldn't need lots of subjective feedback to find out whether they were smart or whether they were achieved or not. It should be self-evident if the objectives were written. So my preference really would maybe to be put 360 at another point in the year, not necessarily at the end of year appraisal, but at a point where we're looking at how can we develop people, motivate people, make them feel valued, help them feel they've got a career with the organisation, as opposed to seeing whether or not they've met their objectives. That's my take on it. So if you're thinking about doing it, what might you want to do? If you're thinking 360 could be something to do, then these are the sort of things I'd suggest you need to bear in mind. And it's interesting that I can't remember who it was, but someone further up the chat said the senior managers wouldn't do this in your organisation. I wonder why that is. Are they scared of what they might find? What are they nervous about? Maybe they don't feel that the right behaviours are being demonstrated. It shows actually, it's just quite an interesting one. But it is a legitimate point that actually not every culture is ready for feedback, and you can develop them towards it. So setting up for success, one of the main things to make sure that whoever you are going to deliver 360 feedback to, make sure that the set of questions is relevant to their role or the role they aspire to. So if I'm working with an executive board member, there's no point in me giving them a really basic low-level set of questions, because it's really not going to identify any helpful growth areas. So you can have different templates or questions. And actually on our 360 Now product, we have 6 standard templates. But when I say standard, there's a set which one is for a senior manager, one is for a manager, one is for an individual contributor, i.e. somebody that doesn't have any direct reports. And the questions are worded to be more appropriate to those roles. Now, in your organisation, you want them to be worded against your values or whatever it is you are wanting to measure. The other thing, which is really an interesting one, is that sometimes statements, so what you're basically talking about is a set of statements, and I would say have 20 to 30 absolute maximum statements in there, and I'll show you an example in a moment. But you want to keep those statements really simple and relevant, and try not to ask more than one thing in the same sentence, which is harder than you think, because it's really about being succinct and working out what are the most important things to ask. If you ask 2 things in one statement and your respondents have to rate it, the reality is, unless they explain the context in the comments, it's easy for misinterpretation, because it's hard to think of an example now. So if I said someone is a great listener and provides good quality input, or someone is a great question, asks open questions and listens actively. All right, questioning and listening are 2 different things. So I might be somebody who asks great questions, but then I talk over the response. I probably am, actually. So that would be that's actually I might get then marked down for that. And I'm thinking, oh, I think I'm really good at questions. That doesn't make sense to me. But the respondent is answering one half of the question. So what you want to try and do is make sure that your statements are just asking one thing in that statement. I also say that roll it out top down, and actually 360 feedback in this way in which we're talking about it is an investment. So it is for key roles, for senior managers, for leaders, maybe mid-managers. It's not for absolutely everybody, unless there's a retention or a career pathway that you're trying to manage. But as you're rolling it, what I would recommend is don't start midway in your organization. You might think, why is that? The reason that I recommend that is that sometimes, or really because you want the senior leaders to understand the value of it and the importance of providing quality feedback. If you start with the mid-managers, then you're dependent on the senior leader to provide feedback, and they will often not realize that they are identifiable personally. They may not give good quality feedback. They may never have experienced it, and they may not recognize how important it is just to put the time and thinking into it. Whereas if you start at the top and then roll down, then those people who are feeding back on the middle managers have experienced the power of the 360 feedback, so they're much more likely to give it appropriate time and quality responses. Do keep an anonymity, so we put as minimum numbers of responses and we won't generate the report unless you hit those minimums. So it protects as anonymity because that will protect the way in which 360 is perceived in your organization. I would say don't do it unless you could provide professional, and that could be in-house professionals, one-to-one feedback or coaching. I really don't think it's a good idea just to hand the feedback to people. I know some organizations do, but the reality is that if you've been on my previous webinars, actually feedback in itself, it triggers our fight or flight response. So people find it hard, whatever, written feedback. And if they're having to process it themselves, it's human nature for people to look for the negatives. So people will get much more out of it if it's supported by one-to-one coaching. So if that means you do fewer of them or do them less regularly, fine, but do it to a high quality. Ensure the scene is set consistently and constructively. I will tell you what that is in a moment. And ensure that the focus is constructive and developmental. So people are focusing on what they can do well and what they can do more of. So areas where I think it fits well, excuse me, I'm just going to turn my radiator off because I'm going super hot now. As I said before, where we've maybe got a senior leadership program, or we want to develop the leadership team, maybe you feel there's a bit of dysfunction up there, or you want to personalize the feedback, then it works really well there, supported by coaching. If you want to measure or embed values or competencies, so develop the behaviors in your organization, that's a great way of doing it. If we want to do career assessments or career development, which I was talking before, and one of the things we used to use it for was to measure return on investment on a training program. So if you're going to spend money on training, you might want to evaluate where people are. If you're doing, you want to show evidence for where the spend's gone, you could do a 360 against the behaviors or skills you're trying to develop within that course. Do it at the start and then do it 6 months after the course is finished. And if there is an improvement, then you're demonstrating that actually you've added value. And actually, that's quite hard. Those of you in training, I'm sure you all know it's quite tricky to demonstrate return on investment. So that could be quite a good route. So one reminder that I always say to people is, if you're delivering feedback, what do you want people to get out of it? And that's why, for me, we want them to feel that they've learned something, that it was fair, that it was constructive, and that it was valuable. So therefore, you need to have the right questions, and that feedback needs to be managed really carefully. Now, I'm just going to whiz through these because you may or may, this will be more for interest for you. I do run things like Train the Trainer, and I've got all this in notes should you be doing a 360 feedback. But if I was delivering 360 feedback with people, then I always put these specific setup in here. It's all about the context. It's all about managing expectations up front, so that should there be something in that feedback that the individual finds hard to take, that they are prepared and they take it in a constructive way. It's all about laying the groundwork so that people are going to take it in the best possible way. So first of all, I'd say, you know, what my role is. So if you are an in-house person or a line manager, I don't think it's ideal to be a line manager providing feedback to your direct reports, but it does happen. But if you are providing 360 feedback to someone that you've contributed to that feedback, then I think it's very important that you position your role and say, I haven't got my manager hat on today, I've got a coach hat on today. So my role here is to facilitate and support you in getting the most out of your 360 feedback report. I'd want to know how they feel about the feedback, and also how they selected their feedback givers. Now, I don't know what you might think about that. What do you think? Why do you think it's important to know how people feel about receiving their 360 feedback and how they selected their feedback givers? I'll give you a moment in case anyone wants to tell me the answer. So the reason I would suggest that you ask them how they're feeling about it, well, that helps you understand, absolutely, Sam, the type of feedback that they are expecting and almost how gentle or how challenging you want to be. So if they are really nervous and, you know, they perhaps, again, depending on, you know, perhaps they're really nervous about it, they've had a bad experience, or they're not quite sure what to expect, then you can be really gentle in terms of the helping them come to terms with the development points and be soft and just softer in your approach. Sometimes people might say, well, they might say, well, actually, I went to my most difficult internal customers because I really wanted some challenging feedback. Well, you know that they're really up to learn and they're feeling quite robust about it, so you can help them really kind of address it in a more robust way. You also know that they genuinely want to learn. Sometimes you find that people have just selected their friends to give the feedback, so then you might want to just challenge them a little bit because they've almost cheated themselves, if you like, and they're not going to get anything real. That does say something about the culture. Why is that? Why are they fearful of getting the truth? So all of that is useful information for you as the coach to know how to pitch your support with people. I would then manage your expectations or concerns. And yes, I think that is a good idea to get line managers to nominate feedback givers. You can also do it where the individual can nominate and line manager might sign off or otherwise, but certainly to make it more objective to suggest it. It's nice to involve people in it as well, but certainly to make sure that there's some balance there. I then want to manage expectations or concerns, and I would set the scene. So in terms of setting the scene, I always talk to people about some of the points I made earlier, really. I would always say at the end of the day, this is just feedback. It's not reality, it's people's perception. I explain that some people are high markers, some people are low markers. And it's really what we need to do is look at the patterns of response as opposed to the actual response. And I say also it is down to the individual as to what they do with the feedback. And if it's true in your environment, and I prefer it if you do it this way, again, going back to the trust thing, then my suggestion is that you say that this is feedback that's just between you and me as your coach. But if you choose to, I'd recommend that you share it with your line manager. And I'd recommend that you drop an email to everybody who took the moment to respond to you to say thank you. So I'd explain something like that and position it with them. So those are the sort of things that I'd position that confidentiality and give them the control and the power, and that reduces the fear for them. I then would look for themes. So I'd go through it with them, help them identify development themes and positive themes, help them reflect which behaviours they've demonstrated that might generate that feedback, identify any areas that they want to get more feedback on, they can learn more from. So it's all thinking about it from a learning growth mentality, really, and then get them to come up with some key actions and next steps. Not loads, just because you can't do everything, but just which are the key points that are really coming out through those consistent messages, and get them to be able to look at those and put the next steps in place. Yeah, and I think, Sam, you're right. If people choose events, it could cause greater issues if they ruminations, if misconstrued. And that's why I think it's so important to have anonymity, so you can't identify it, and to avoid people. So you want to make sure that, you know, people are giving objective feedback. It's not they're not individually identifiable, ideally. Also, you want to encourage your organization and people in the organization to be able to provide quality feedback. So actually feedback shouldn't, even if it is something we can do better, if it's worded constructively, it should be helpful as opposed to something that's criticism. But that's also why I think it's so important to have a coach or a facilitator to help people take it, because you can see if people are taking things very personally. You can try and detract them from drilling into it and identifying whether there's one person or not. And that's again something I talk about in setting the scene. I might say, you know, ultimately people have high and low markers. It doesn't really matter what the absolute score is. The point is it valid feedback that you want to take on board or not? And it's your choice. So I'd want to empower people to take those choices and not start personalizing it, because if they go after people, then what it basically says something about the culture really that needs to be resolved. So softening it, and that's your role as the supporting coach. So the sort of questions that I might say when I'm setting the scene: who did you ask to give feedback? Why did you choose them? What sort of feedback are you expecting them to give you? What sort of relationship do you have with this person? What do you hope to get out of this? What are your expectations? And then I'd set the scene. So again, you'll get that sense. This is for me, knowing up front, you can tell whether that person is scared or whether they're totally up for it. And that's going to dictate to a certain extent the coaching style that you take with them. And these are what I was saying here in terms of setting the scene. So this is information I would always go through each of these points, whatever the situation, however much, if they've had 360 before or not. And the reason it's so useful to go through it is that if you said this up front and then there is a really difficult bit of feedback in there, you can come back to this point and say, no, you know, feedback is subjective. You know, we said this at the start. It's much, much more powerful, and people hear it. If you've got them to agree and they've heard these points before you start the report, it's much better, because you've kind of agreed that scene setting, than if they go in, they're really upset and you say, yeah, but it's okay, it's just subjective. They don't hear you. If someone's already upset, they won't hear that point. But if you've positioned it, then they will. I'm making it sound like people get upset. They don't get upset that often. Probably about a couple of times, 1 or 2% of the time in all the 360 feedback I've done. But that's because it's been managed well. I have had feedback reports that have looked on the face of it really, really difficult. And because the scene has been set well, it's actually gone down incredibly well with the person. And that's why it's so important to provide some feedback and coaching with it. In fact, let me give you an example here. So if you had, let's see what you think. Let me just help you see what's here. If this person here, this is a spider graph. So generally, I'll answer that question for you in a moment, Myrna. So generally what we would say, this particular example has got a number of questions, and those questions, it's obviously a management report. Those questions were all about people management. So they either sat in people first, expectations, review. Those are the questions that sit in there. And then they've been categorized up. And the yellow here is the individual. So that's their self-report. The manager's score is here. Direct reports are blue. And the purple is others. So whoever else they asked to respond. So if you were going to sit down and do some coaching, you had a quick look at that, what might you think about that report, and what might you want to explore about this person's mindset if you had the report that looked like this? We'll give you a moment to put in the chat. And actually, while I give you a chance to do that, let me answer Myrna's question as well. Who should be responsible to gather the feedback and provide the report? So we would do it electronically, Myrna, so it's all objective. So we have a platform that does that. But someone like yourself, you would want to make sure that the questions that are being asked are well worded. There aren't too many of them. The anonymity has been provided, so there's almost an administration of the report. And then you can bring it out, and then whoever's right, you then give that report to somebody who can then provide that feedback. So that's what Actus 360 now does. So it automates all of that, and you just have an administrator, someone like yourself, who can actually just oversee the report feedback. Totally, Mike. So both of you, Mike and Sam. So you think, okay, this person isn't very confident, are they? Potentially, they're not sure what value they're bringing to their role. They've really rated themselves significantly beneath everyone else, certainly in terms of managing performance. Now, it's an interesting one. So it suggests insecurity. Interestingly, I'd also look at their relationship with their manager, because they're quite close to their manager, except for managing performance. So maybe there's been an issue in terms of managing underperformance. Who are their peers? I'd want to know who the others are. Is it their best friends because they've rated them brilliantly, or is it someone else? So as to what's real. So there's a lot here, you guys. There's an interesting setup that's worth exploring what's going on behind the scenes in terms of what their mindset is and who has responded, for you to actually get a sense of how accurate and real the feedback is. So it's all really about coaching, but exploring that setup. So on that, on the positive of something like that, if this person is lacking confidence, this is quite a nice confidence building report. Although you do sometimes find that people will mark themselves down almost like a fake humility because they want to feel okay. They don't want to be seen to overrate themselves. How about this one? So this one, the yellow is the self, the blue is the other, and the purple is the other. And then the blue is the direct report. This is actually a real feedback form, by the way. How would you feel about having to do this one? But they both are actually, they are real ones that I've seen. This is an incredibly unusual situation, this one. I'll just have, as a coach, I don't know about you, as you're looking at that, if you had to deliver that feedback, my heart would sink. Yes, Sandeep, I really don't think that line managers should do feedback session. On this one, the line manager hasn't contributed. I recently did train the trainer for a company that does, the line manager does do it, but because the line manager is normally contributing, the line manager could be part of the problem. And so it's not objective. So I think it should usually be someone in HR or someone external who provides the feedback, so that it is a safe developmental experience for them. If we're talking about this kind of stuff, if you're talking about it as part of an appraisal and whether someone's performed, then slightly different. But personally, I don't think 360 fits there as well. I think you could have general feedback gathered by the line manager for performance. That would be my take. So anyone feel happy about doing this? I looked at this and I was concerned about this. What this basically says is there is a complete disconnect between the individual's perception of their performance and how the others and the direct reports are responding. You notice though, actually the scores went as high as 5 or 6. So this person hasn't even rated themselves very well. What I actually did with this one is actually I went back to the organisation because it concerned me. The manager had refused to comment. Why were they even doing a 360? It was a one-off 360, and it was quite clear that they've got direct reports that were having a go. There was some agenda going on about this poor person who'd be asked to do the 360. So in the end, I actually went through the organisation and wasn't prepared to provide it unless the manager was involved. And actually, I didn't think it would be a constructive conversation. Now, I have had similar patterns where it has been appropriately done. It's been, the individual just has been a bit more confident and they've gone, you know what, it doesn't surprise me. I can see why they've rated me that way. But that's where it's so important to set the scene, because it's much easier to come back because there can be some political challenges underneath that feedback. It's rare, but having that skill to deliver the feedback, or someone who's neutral can manage it in a really much more constructive way. So then, to close down the feedback positively, what would I recommend people do is I would get people to identify a couple of strengths that they can build on, ideally a couple of development areas. So it's not just about looking at what you develop and go, right, what do you do well? Help people to recognize that this feedback is telling them lots of things that they're doing brilliantly and to do more of them. But then also to look at development areas. I recommend that people email their contributors. So even though they don't know who said what, the fact that they responded and gave feedback is really helpful. And that helps to perpetuate a positive feedback culture. I've warned them not to chastise or hunt down anyone who made a particular comment. And I would consider sharing the feedback with the manager for further discussion. So what I will do now is I'll just run through what our 360 Now platform does, if anyone's interested in more of this, and I'll also answer some other questions. So there's a couple of other questions that have come through. One is about how might you deal with 360 in a small organization where anonymity might be a challenge. Well, I would say that it's just as important, if not more important, in a small organization. So we're only 14, 15 people. I intend to do 360 feedback with our team. What I'd say about it is, though, make sure it's positioned in a constructive way, make sure someone neutral is going to provide the feedback, and make sure that you still have enough numbers. I mean, if you can only have one person reporting, I would anonymize the scores. So if you are only 6 people in the organization, I would categorize everybody into that category so that it's a generalized feedback, as opposed to, Fred said this and rated you that, and Melissa said that and rated you there. You don't want it to be that pointed, but I think you can do it really powerfully in a small organization. It just needs to be positioned really constructively, and you could educate people about what quality feedback looks like before. So if any of you will send the link out to the webinar that I did 2 weeks ago, which was what is good quality feedback. You might want to just make sure that people understand that feedback shouldn't be opinion. It's not judgmental. It should be about giving examples. It's about evidence. So you could develop people to be able to give good quality feedback. So then it's nothing's negative. It's actually just noticing what people do and what's the impact, as opposed to saying what someone did and it's good or bad. So it's a really good opportunity to develop an open culture. And actually, in a small organizations grow. They can be very political. So actually opening up people's self-awareness is a useful thing to do. So I think it can be a really good tool there. So it's 360 now, just as I said on this one, I don't normally talk about products, but I will talk about Actus 360 now and on this one, just to give you a positioning. So this is a standalone aspect of Actus. So we do performance management, but we realized that people didn't always need performance management, but 360, particularly in this hybrid world, is really useful. So we have developed the 360 Now platform, which allows you to manage and deliver 360 feedback. So if you are in a small company, you could have your own platform and just run the 360 through there. So you just set up the templates and it does all the hard work for you. It generates the report and it manages the anonymity and the data. If you're an independent practitioner, you could do it for other people. So it could be part of your sort of value-added services. So what is it? You can see here, this is what a report might look like. So you get a spider graph, which is a summary, and these are the different graphs. So this particular one here, I think that says leadership, performance management. So those are the categories. There would have been 4 or 5 questions around leadership behind them, and the different lines here. So you can see that the dark blue here would be the individual. The manager is in yellow, my direct reports are in red, and my peers are in blue, and this is showing the range. So it's showing the difference, and you can see, therefore, if I was sitting down with somebody and coaching them, I can see that my peers have a similar opinion to myself, but there's a gap in these areas, and you could then explore where that gap comes from. It also then goes into more detail in the actual report itself. So it gives you heat maps where you see what the high scores are, what the lower scores are, and it feeds through into asking, what are your strengths and what are your development areas. So it's a report that can be used to coach and to support people in thinking about it in a really constructive way. And you can manage you could actually manage it so you as the HR professional can deliver the feedback and let them have it, either hard copy or electronically. So what does it offer? It's basically a hosted 360 platform. So you're just able to have that platform and generate the reports. You can pay as you go. You pay a small amount to have the platform. It depends on whether or not you want it within an organization. So let's say you want to do 20 reports a year, then you just have to pay an amount that reflects 20 reports a year, and you can buy more if you want to. It allows you to automate all the email messaging. It allows you to set up the questionnaire design and presentation. One of the nice things that we do, which others wouldn't necessarily do, is that, as you know, I'm a psychologist. So anyone who buys the platform, we will work with you. There's ready to go templates, but I will also provide an hour's consultancy. If you've got your own competencies or values, I can help build a set of templates specifically for your culture, if that's something that you want to measure, because sometimes people don't know how to do that. So we're able to offer that service as well. So we've got various other things, competency templates, and it's just quite straightforward. So it's a really nice tool, a really nice thing to enhance the culture. If you're looking to develop your leadership culture, your strategic culture, your career pathways, it could be a really useful, cost-effective tool. So if anyone does want to know more about that, don't want to be a hard sell, that's what it is. And it's brand new, launching, this is a bit of a sneak preview, launching in March. If anyone would, in fact, I'll put if anyone wants to know more about this, before I tell you what else is coming up, I'll pop this other poll up. So if you'd like to know more about it, whether it's a one-to-one demo on Actus 360 now, we'll probably do a group demo, actually logged into it. If you want to know anything about our training that we run, the software itself, or our e-learning, do please just indicate here. We're more than happy to chat to you about that. And let me just share here what's coming up. So yeah, next month, the topic is learning in March. So the first webinar is going to be how to create a culture of psychological safety. And actually that does mean if you're using 360 to use it in a constructive way. If you're a member of the HR Uprising, which is our LinkedIn group, linked to the podcast, then the HR Uprising Coffee Club is on the 9th of March, which is more of a networking conversation. And that's when our next set of training courses are kicking off as well. So yes, actually Change Superhero has already started, so we'd have to update these ones, Caitlin. We've got that was halfway through the superhero, so the next one will be kicking off probably summertime, I mean April, May. We'll provide you with more links at the moment to the resources on our future webinars. Do take a look at the website. There is, I think the website it's not up at the moment. It will be up later on today, hopefully. So if any of these links aren't working, don't worry about it. But Caitlin will send out these slides with some links to them later. Okay, so I hope you found that of interest. It was what you expected. I actually really value any feedback that you might have. And thank you so much for contributing and taking part in this. And if anyone else has got any questions, if you want to stay on, I'm happy to take the questions. Do feel free, I'll stay around for a few minutes.